to the channel, and I'm excited to share this with you guys. I got the opportunity yesterday to share this with a group of students from here at Michigan State University in our Lyman Briggs College, and I thought, you know what, I should make a quick video about this while I have it all up, because it's some stuff that's pretty important to my dissertation, and so I thought it'd be a privilege to share with you guys anyway. All right, so today we're gonna, of course, be talking about evolution. That is my specialty here at Michigan State, and particularly we're gonna be talking about the theory of evolution, and we'll be making a critical distinction between the fact of evolution, which is essentially that it happened and that it's a valid explanation for the origin of species, and Darwin's radical theory of descent with modification that we now call evolution via natural selection. The central idea of this presentation is that in order to address many of the challenges in thinking about evolution, we need to be able to clearly recognize the difference between accepting the fact of evolution and understanding the implications of the theory. All right, and the title is Wonderful Lie, The Radical's Guide to Evolutionary Fatalism. And Wonderful Lie is a play on words of the title Wonderful Life, which is a book by Stephen Jay Gould that I'll be talking a bit about. And it is a source of a very, I like to think of it as famous thought experiment called Replaying Life's Tape. And we'll be talking about that concept and history behind it and how it relates to this idea of evolutionary fatalism and the implications of that. So let's go ahead and get started. And first, we'll talk about exactly this idea of replaying life's tape. This comes to us from Stephen Jay Gould, and it comes from his book, Wonderful Life. He says, we live in a world of good news and bad news. The good news is that we can specify an experiment to decide between the conventional and the radical interpretations of extinction, thereby settling the most important question we can ask about the history of life. The bad news is that we can't possibly perform the experiment. I call this experiment replaying life's tape. You press the rewind button and making sure you thoroughly erase everything that actually happened, go back to any time and place in the past, say to the seas of the Burgess Shale, then let the tape run again and see if the repetition looks at all like the original. If each replay strongly resembles life's actual pathway, then we must conclude that what really happened pretty much had to occur. But suppose that the experimental versions all yield sensible results strikingly different from the actual history of life. What could we then say about the predictability of self-conscious intelligence, or of mammals, or vertebrates, or of life on land, or simply of multicellular persistence for 600 million difficult years? I call this the gospel according to Gould. But what is this thought experiment really about? It sounds to me like some sort of weird paleontologist fantasy. What do you mean replay the tape of life? It sounds like something you think of as a professor one day after you've had too much for lunch and you're trying to avoid dozing off before going to your next lecture. Of course, when you have a fantasy after hours, that's your own business. But if it's on the clock, well, that's a thought experiment. So what is this conventional view? What is the radical alternative? And how can he claim that this fantasy can settle the most important question about the history of life? Let's start by trying to understand the conventional view. But first, I'd like to take a bit of a detour that I think is actually quite important. All right.
Sentiment at all. And then I find this. All the evidence available in the biological sciences supports the core proposition that the cosmos is a specially designed whole with life and mankind as its fundamental goal and purpose. A whole in which all facets of reality have their meaning and explanation in this central fact. Well, that's Michael Dennett. He's a creationist.
All right. So every time you say it, you make another copy in your head. Every time you say it, you make another copy in your head. That's another saying of this gentleman who we just heard from, Daniel Dennett. And so let's go through this one more time. All the evidence available in the biological sciences supports the core proposition that the cosmos is a specially designed whole with life and mankind as its fundamental goal and purpose, a whole in which all facets of reality have their meaning and explanation in this central fact. So I believe many of you are familiar with Daniel Dennett rather, sorry. He's the author of Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and he's quoting Michael Denton from the book The Purpose-Driven Life by Pastor Rick Warren. Some of you may be surprised to hear this, but sometime before I became a graduate student in evolutionary biology, I worked as a youth minister and community organizer at a Reformed church in Newark, New Jersey. Not only did I read The Purpose-Driven Life, I also read Pastor Warren's book, Counterfeit Gods, in a single day. I quite enjoyed both books. Obviously, I couldn't put it down. And here's another fact that may surprise you. I 100% believed in evolution during that time of my life, just as I do today. Today, it would be tempting to dismiss this statement as a theologically inspired pastoral claim that may happen to be incidentally a little unscientific, so perhaps we should just move on. I believe that would be a mistake. First and foremost, all genuine claims about human nature deserve to be treated with respect and taken seriously. But more importantly, I would be wrong to do so because this is a scientific claim. Beyond that, I hope to show that it's a scientific claim that is consistent with what Gould and others would refer to as the conventional interpretation of natural history. In other words, it's a scientific claim that being aligned with the conventional interpretation has an important past in the history of science that we need to understand if we're going to address it appropriately. So let's talk about this conventional interpretation. So these are the presuppositions of what I call the conventional view, what I refer to as evolutionary fatalism, a term borrowed from the American paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, because it results in quite literally fatalistic reasoning about evolution. To understand how, let's look at each presupposition. The first presupposition is progress. It's the idea that primitive, older organisms are deemed simpler and thus somehow inferior to more recent, quote-unquote, highly evolved organisms. Natural history records this progress through geological time. This implies a natural hierarchy or steps to ascend, you might think of it as. The next is that it's directed. The idea that natural history records change in a particular, more or less linear path towards particular ends. The steps unfold in an orderly fashion. The third presupposition is that it's predictable, that processes underlying natural history suggest a peculiar reliability that infer a certain inevitability of certain outcomes, particularly the emergence of Homo sapiens or something like it. All roads lead to anthropogenesis or becoming human. And Stephen Jay Gould is brilliant, and one of the things I love most about Wonderful Life is that in addition to just being just this fascinating case built from this astounding evidence and all the wonderful storytelling in it, is that in addition to making these really concrete philosophical arguments, he talks about this iconography, the idea that the presuppositions and biases that we bring to our work, because in this case he's talking about the work he does with other scientists and talking about the other scientists that have been involved in the history of this particular site called the Burgess Shale, which is in Canada, and it's a particularly important geological site, and it dates back to about 50 million years after what we call the Cambrian explosion. And so it's this really important time in the evolution of multicellular life. And a gentleman by the name of Walcott has established this particular quarry there rather on that site. And Gould is in the course of Wonderful Life sort of reinterpreting the evidence of what we in anthropology playfully call the bones and stones of the situation, right? Looking at the fossils. And so he calls this the sort of biases and the way we bring them to how we represent our ideas, the iconography of progress. And when I'm writing about them, I think of them as the iconography of idolatry, right? Because his point is really that we're sort of reconstructing natural history in our own image, right? And so I just think of that as a playful way of thinking about what he's talking about when he's talking about this iconography of progress. And this first image comes to us from 1579. It's called The Great Chain of Being. And it depicts sort of the, common understanding of the natural hierarchy, right? And of course, we have the deity up top, and the deity is depicted above, a level of angels, because they're like entirely spiritual beings, but they can also kind of have bodies, right? And so then like below them is humans, and they just have bodies, but they also have like souls, right? And like brains and things. So they kind of have a little transition there. And then there's below them is like the animals who have like the brains and the bodies, but don't have the souls, right? And then below them is like the plants, right? And so I love it because it seems like it's quick to dismiss it as like weird or like theological or something like that. But it really had, in a sense, this sort of natural history to it, like this sort of observation that there was an ordering, and it was based on the idea that things at higher levels had the attributes of things at lower levels, and then unique attributes that the things at the lower levels didn't have, but that couldn't fully be represented because they didn't have all the attributes of the things above them in the hierarchy. All right, so there was a serious thinking there, right? So it wasn't like we plucked this literally out of thin air, although it may have been figuratively plucked out of thin air. Anyway, so. And of course, you've all seen something like this. We call this the March of Progress, although the actual original drawing in this publication is called The Road to Homo Sapiens. And this is the full version of Rudolf Zollinger's The Road of Homo Sapiens above the folded version from Early Man in 1965. And you can notice how the folded version exaggerates linear progression of forms here from, like a primate ancestor and into, Homo sapien in its current form. And this type of depiction obviously is inconsistent with the branching nature of evolutionary relationships, but also, of course, it's also inconsistent with our usually oversimplified retelling of history. And actually, the authors even in this actually try to draw a lot more distinction and nuance to the subject than they're given credit for. But of course, this is sort of the image that became canonical in these sort of representations of evolution, and of course mocked now in our current climate because of their inaccuracy. But we should of course appreciate it with a little bit more nuance. But there it is, and then I refer to this as from ascension to descent, turning the chain of being on its side. And this comes from David Depew, who says, he's talking about John Dewey, and he says, Dewey saw evidence of the incompleteness of an active resistance to the Darwinian revolution and the recrudescence of absolutistic philosophies that pay lip service to Darwinian evolution by turning on its side the great chain of being with its hierarchically ordered ranks of essentially defined types ranging from monad to man and watching it unfold in time, right? So that's this idea, if we like take this great chain of being, we'd be like, hard right turn, we then can keep our sort of ordered thinking in place and just, turn it into something like this, and then we watch that unfold in time. And he's saying like, that's just weak sauce. And Gould brings up one other really critical iconography, and that's the idea of the cone of increasing diversity versus his depiction of decimation and diversification. And critically, that this depiction is based on his interpretation of that Burgess Shale fauna. And he's saying that the conventional view of cone of increasing diversity is incorrect, because in Gould's view, which I'll show you guys over here, is that if you notice in the cone of increasing diversity, we go back to like, okay, yeah, so we accept we have common ancestry, okay, but then we sort of just show these depictions of sort of what he talks about as shoehorning when we find like old forms, we kind of shoehorn them into somewhere along the lineage of current forms, which like we're going up this way in time. So this is like back in time down at the base, and this would be like the current living organisms up here at the top. And he's saying basically we sort of shoehorn things when we find fossils. We tend to just shoehorn them into here so that they make sense based on the way we currently think of let's say the family of organisms and how they're related to each other. And he's going, this is old hat. That's not going to work anymore, because what I'm really seeing is that actually there's like, if you look earlier on, there's a way bigger diversity of fossils here. There's way different types of organisms. They're all wild, they're crazy, they don't like anything that's still alive today. Matter of fact, if we tried to classify them up here, we would have no idea where to put them. And so he represents us by this like much broader base. We're literally talking about going from this thingy, you know, it's like okay, you got some branching, but it's still getting that canonical kind of tree-like thing. And he's going, nah, you got to be more like a Christmas tree that's got a fat bottom. And then most things get wiped out, right? And then the few things that get left behind, mostly due to good luck, they then diversify into the families that we see now. And that's a huge part of his point too. It's not that just that most things get wiped out by the ruthless nature of mass extinction. It's that most things get wiped out, and if you were on the scene and you were able to sort of say, okay, well, I really got a great understanding of all the organisms that are here at the same time, you would have no clue how to predict who actually made it. And if you did, you'd probably be wrong. And matter of fact, if we, he kind of looks at some other sites that they find where they have like different assemblages of life from, around the same time and in different places. And they go, yeah, matter of fact, if we make predictions over here, then they're kind of blown up if we go over here. And if we'd have projected earlier in time, we'd have been way wrong, right? So that's really a huge part of it too, is it's not just that most things don't survive, but most things don't survive and you can't predict the winners and losers. All right. And so this is what he talks about. And of course, I call this trying to tie these two together so we see the relationship, the purpose-driven history of life. The fatuous idea of a single order amidst the multifarious diversity of modern life flows from our conventional iconographies and the prejudices that nurture them. The ladder of life and the cone of increasing diversity. By the ladder, horseshoe crabs are judged as simple. By the cone, they are deemed old, and one implies the other under the grand conflation. Down the ladder also means old, while low on the cone denotes simple. I don't think that any particular secret, mystery, or inordinate subtlety underlies the reason for our allegiance to these false iconographies of ladder and cone. They are adopted because they nurture our hopes for a universe of intrinsic meaning defined in our own terms. All right. So now it's pop quiz time. See, I say if I can't think of any better evidence against arguments from authority, it's that you can never trust an instructor. These people always have a pop quiz lurking somewhere. But I promise you, this might be the only one. All right, so let's check this out. This is the Reverend Al Sharpton, who I'm going to go ahead and say I'm trying not to pick on. I'm going with him because I respect him a lot. I actually met him. He's another person I read as a young person. He signed a book for me. I love what he does in terms of civil rights and public discourse, and I actually appreciate him for coming out and engaging and debating with some of my heroes, especially in situations that really, really, really lack diversity, and I appreciate him for coming out and doing those things. But let's see if we can recognize something here.
So to pick up mankind in its evolving state does not tell me where mankind began, how it became a long story of ordered steps. Well, who ordered them? Why do things follow such a natural progression? Who set the progress? And in fact...
Okay, so, right? So next time you hear that and your mind immediately jumps to like, or immediately like my own bias as an evolutionary biologist to be like, that's Darwin denial. He's denying evolution. No, right? He's saying, when you pick up the story in its evolution, he's accepting evolution. He's saying, I'm seeing evolution. I'm seeing fossils. I'm seeing progression. Okay, who sets the progress? Who puts it in order? Okay, this is not an unscientific view. This is a very scientific view, and that was the humbling thing for me in the extra motivation to write about it. Because you kind of obviously it should be obvious that the ideas have a strong history, but when you realize just how deep it is, though, it's kind of profound. All right, so this is something I stumbled across when preparing a manuscript on this, and it gave me tremendous delight because, of course, the feeling of discovery is best when totally unanticipated. Let's revisit the quote I highlighted at the beginning of this section. If we simply change one letter, what we might think of as an innocuous seeming non-synonymous mutation, the simple change of an R to an N results in transforming the word core into cone. I believe doing so reveals just how well the purpose-driven perspective aligns with the conventional interpretation of the Great Question. All right, so here's the original. All the evidence available in the biological sciences supports the core proposition that the cosmos is a specially designed whole with life and mankind as its fundamental goal and purpose, a whole in which all facets of reality have their meaning and explanation in this central fact. With our mutation, all the evidence available in the biological sciences supports the cone proposition that the cosmos is a specially designed whole with life and mankind as its fundamental goal and purpose, a whole in which all facets of reality have their meaning and explanation in this central fact. Every time you say it, you make another copy in your head. All right. So, in the year 2000, a celebration was held in honor of Stephen Jay Gould for contributing over 300 articles to the publication Natural History. Gould himself gave the keynote address. You can find it on YouTube if you search for Stephen Jay Gould plus Evolution Revolution. It's a real treat because if you read scientific literature, you rarely get to see and hear the scientist in person. It's a great shame the way the dutiful work of most scientists has the unfortunate side effect of hiding from public consumption the tremendous personalities of some of our greatest thinkers. I hope you do consider spending some more time with Dr. Gould, who left us with an overwhelming body of work, and he was quite a character. That's to say nothing of the extraordinarily complex man, Charles Darwin. Anyway, during his speech, Gould indeed aims to impress upon his audience the truly radical nature of Darwin's theory. I will do neither justice, but let's give it a shot. So Gould starts with telling the story. He says, one of the most interesting aspects of Darwin's life and the most revealing is that he developed the theory of natural selection in pretty much its complete form in 1838. And he didn't publish until 1859. That's one of the long-standing puzzles in Darwinian scholarship. Why does he delay 21 years? The old heroic explanation that he was just collecting his facts, he didn't want to jump the gun, that simply can't be right. It must have been fear and not just mere collection. I don't think fear of exposing evolution, it's not that heretical a view, but of exposing the radical content of his own take on evolution. So I titled the slide The Unrivaled Revolution. I don't know how else to say it, but Gould makes this point, and he does so with so much humor, you'd love it. But he basically compares the Darwinian revolution to the Copernican revolution, and he's trying to understand, well, why do we have so much more resistance to the Darwinian revolution than the Copernican revolution? And basically he boils it down to that the Copernican revolution, of course, represented most by Copernicus and Galileo, and I have statues here to show the iconography of the other side, if you will. We build our own idols. But that revolution's about real estate, okay? That's just about, as you see there on the left, it's just about redrawing the map, okay? We just gotta, we gotta do a better job of where we put ourselves in the neighborhood, okay? That's about real estate. That's about where we go in the cul-de-sac, okay? But the Darwinian revolution, and I like to think of it as even, not being so hasty to overlook the title of it, right? On the Origin of Species. It says this is about essence. This is about who we are. It's about where we are. When do we come to be? How? On the origin of species, right? Like, that's a lot right there. And so he says that's why this is so hard for us. So before we go on, I want to say a couple things about what you might be surprised to hear me say, or may not, that cannot be the radical elements of Darwin's theory. If we're to hold Dr. Gould to task about this claim that Darwin's theory is indeed radical, right, then we're going to need some convincing. And so let's just clear a couple things up about what it can't be. Darwin's theory can't be radical because it's a theory of evolution, right? There were lots of evolutionists, not only during Darwin's time, but the idea has deep roots going back to much earlier scientists. It can't be any of the basic elements of the theory. It can't be having a theory of adaptation, for instance. People were perfectly comfortable with the fit between organisms and their environments, wonderfully suited to their way of life. That's not it. Can't be having a theory of variation. Everybody accepted that there's variation in populations. Doesn't take a radical genius to figure that out. Okay, well, what about inheritance? Feels a little embarrassing almost to even say this, but it is an essential element of the theory. But nope, that can't be it. Obviously, everyone accepted theories of inheritance and various modes of reproduction. It's also not a theory of natural selection. There have been natural selectionists going back to ancient times, just as there were scientific creationists going back to ancient times, although a lot of them were pagan, because history's weird like that. And all right, so we're just trying to be even-handed. Let's see what the claim is about what's so radical about this theory. And so Gould, in the speech, he says there are three radical elements to Darwin's theory. The first is the radical nature of the theory itself, or what I like to think of as what it says about adaptation. Two, what it says about variation. And three, what it says about historicity. And it really almost seems as though, like, that's exactly what I just said can't be the radical elements of the theory, which is interesting and a point we'll come back to. But it's just interesting to note at this point that it must be something particular about these things, because it cannot be just the fact that it's a theory that has these elements in and of itself. So let's start with the radical nature of the theory of itself, and that's essentially that it's not progressive. The first element concerns what Gould refers to as the radical nature of the theory itself. Darwin's theory contradicted the teleology, that's explanation in terms of purpose rather than cause, of evolutionary progress, what they call orthogenesis. He did so by describing a completely natural mechanism that produces exclusively local adaptation. That would be natural selection. He preferred to call his theory descent with modification. Gould says Darwin wouldn't have called this process that. By that he means evolution, because it was an incredibly radical theory of a naturalistic mechanism, which he calls natural selection, because it yielded only local adaptation. Gould suggests the parasite that becomes so morphologically simplified that it's just a bag of reproductive tissues in the interior of its host is no less well adapted than complex us are to our exteriors. And we probably each have a reasonably equal chance of extended geological persistence. That's what the theory's about. All right, well, what about what it says about variation? It says that it's not directed. Darwin's theory predates our modern understanding of DNA and population genetics, but he was nevertheless able to draw a connection between variation within a population and differences between species. Perhaps even more significantly to his theory, he believed that the source of this variation was undirected. Gould says, in Platonic traditions, variation is accident, which literally means falling away from the mean, or the essence of the thing. Variation is traditionally treated as a set of odd accidents of individual imperfect incarnations of an inherent essence. And therefore the essence is central and the variation is mere accident. Darwin completely inverts that. In Darwinian thought, the variation is the essence. What is the essence of the species but the spectrum of its variation, which is available for conversion into evolutionary change. That's a profound change in perception, and it's of great practical importance. All right, so we're going to take a brief detour because I need to introduce you to the word I hate the most, the Iconographgy. And there, I tried it. You've heard me try it. It's painful. But look, this is what happens when you try to learn things. Let's see how to pronounce this word, internet.
Ichneumonidae or D.
Ichneumonidae or D. Okay.
Ichneumonidae.
What? What? Ichneumonidae? All right. Third option, you'll settle this. Which one of them is right?
Ichneumonidae. I will repeat it more slowly.
No, it's okay. You don't have to repeat it. Oh my goodness. That's some real behind the scenes stuff. That's what happens when you're doing your research. All right. Back to our slideshow. All right, so this is a bit of a detour, but of course it's relevant, so we'll take it. I love reading Darwin. Many evolutionary biologists do. He was a tremendous writer. Hang on, let me get rid of that. And you're always stumbling across something new and wonderful. This passage is from a very famous letter Darwin wrote to her friend Asa Gray. Gray, a scientist and of devout faith, was having a bit of trouble grappling with the implications of Darwin's theory himself, and he eventually comes to rest on the idea that we refer to as directed variation, basically the notion that the ultimate source of variation between organisms was in some way guided towards increasing complexity and ultimately the emergence of Homo sapiens. Darwin reveals highly enlightening aspects of his own intellectual maturation. Darwin was so sharp and clever in his response, but also clear. So he says, with respect to the theological view of the question, this is always painful to me. I am bewildered. I had no intention to write atheistically, but I own that I cannot see, as plainly as others do, and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. There seems to me too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. Not believing this, I see no necessity in the belief that the eye was expressly designed. On the other hand, I cannot anyhow be contented to view this wonderful universe, and especially the nature of man, and to conclude that everything is the result of brute force. I am inclined to look at everything as resulting from design laws, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance. Not that this notion at all satisfies me. And that's what that, with the details left to chance, he makes clear his rejection of directed variation, however humbly he chose to do so. But one of the newsy bits that you may have missed out on last year is that this family of wasps was actually renamed the Darwin wasp in 2020 because of the tremendous influence that they had on his thinking. And so I'm going to miss my pet name for them, which was Demon Wasp, but I think their new name is much better. So I wrote about them when I first learned about them to my advisor and to my mom and to some of my friends because that story was super profound, just reading it. And I looked them up and it looked like this thing from, oh my God, like your worst nightmare. Like it actually looks like a demon. And this family and related wasps do all sorts of stuff. They make like zombies out of some of their prey hosts, weird logical, apocalyptic relationship that they have with other things. They make slaves out of there's slave making ants. There's all sorts of stuff that goes on in the insect world that I want no part of at all. Okay, so this we also have to talk about because it's something that kind of touches me is I think that a lot of times it's very easy to think that if you're a fan of Darwin and a fan of evolution, or you think it's, you know, really important, and you're kind of seeing it come up against some of the ideas in our popular culture that are maybe not so open to it. It's easy to sort of think of it as like this like science versus like non-scientific people, right? And I think that's like again, it's like a little short-sighted. I think it doesn't really help us think about the ideas in their proper. We should be talking about the ideas and not the people. And so I love just showing how the people behind it are a little bit more complex than we like to think. And so I love that Darwin talks about with the theological implications of his question that it was painful to him. And even when he comes to this conclusion saying, you know, hey, not that it necessarily gives me any great satisfaction to come to this way of thinking, but this is in fact where I'm led, you know. So, and I think one of the beautiful ways to see this is he's very candid before he gets married with his wife, who remained devout as far as we know her whole life, and it's very interesting to see different stories about like some of his notes, I guess, being in like her Bible and things like that. So kind of thinking, you know, they probably continued to really engage pretty seriously on both sides of this throughout their relationship. So this is a letter she wrote back to him before they got married, when she was still Emma Wedgwood. She is also Darwin's first cousin. That was a little bit more common during that time, but it is still fairly common in a lot of places in the world. So just is what it is. I call this radical love. She says, when I'm with you, all melancholy thoughts keep out of my head, but since you are gone, some sad ones have forced themselves in, a fear that our opinions on the most important subject should differ widely. My reason tells me that honest and conscientious doubts cannot be a sin, but I feel it would be a painful void between us. I thank you from my heart for your openness with me, and I should dread the feeling that you are concealing your opinions from the fear of giving me pain. It is perhaps foolish of me to say this, but my own dear Charlie, we now do belong to each other, and I cannot help being open with you. Will you do me a favor? Yes, I'm sure you will. It is to read our Savior's farewell discourse to his disciples, which begins at the end of the 13th chapter of John. It is so full of love to them and devotion and every beautiful feeling. It is the part of the New Testament I love best. This is a whim of mine. It would give me great pleasure, though I can hardly tell why. I don't wish you to give me your opinion about it. I love that. Love that. All right. So what does Darwin's theory say about historicity? Well, quite frankly, it says that it's not predictable. And Gould really has a strong case here. He says, under what I'm calling more user-friendly notions of evolution, you may still think you can construe it as a predictable sequence. Maybe every little detail isn't predictable. There's a broad kind of progress. That's inherent. To this day, most people who exclaim a belief in evolution, who even consider themselves Darwinian, still see it that way. The vernacular understanding of evolution is that it's a process that means increasing complexity. If you can't exactly be sure that Homo sapiens would have emerged, at least something like it is very likely, because that's what evolution means. But Darwinian evolution isn't that. One of the most fascinating things that flows from it, it is only about local adaptation. And local adaptation is to immediate environments. Immediate environments are changing essentially on random vectors through geological time. So that even if you have the determinism of local adaptation for any moment, since it's a determinism of local adaptation to fluctuating environments that are essentially stochastic through time, it's going to give you a stochastic pattern for the history of life. And therefore, you're stuck in a true Darwinian world. You're going to be stuck with a view of unpredictable history. That's a scary notion, that actual history is unpredictably contingent. This notion of unpredictably contingent history is in fact Gould's claim to fame. It's the central claim of Wonderful Life. And that's why I refer to the alternative as Wonderful Lie. All right, and so that brings us to the radical revision. Gould says the old chain of being would provide the greatest comfort. So beautiful. But we now know that the vast majority of simpler creatures are not human ancestors or even prototypes, but only collateral branches on life's tree. The cone of increasing progress and diversity therefore becomes our iconography of choice. The cone implies predictable development from simple to complex, from less to more. Homo sapiens may form only a twig, but if life moves even fitfully toward greater complexity and higher mental powers, then the eventual origin of self-conscious intelligence may be implicit in all that came before. In short, I cannot understand our continued allegiance to the manifestly false iconographies of ladder and cone, except as a desperate finger in the dike of cosmically justified hope and arrogance. All right, so Simpson is writing in 1941 during the time of the Second World War, and during this time it's being argued of the evolutionary progress of man that totalitarianism does seem to be inevitable. So again, the radical interpretation is coming up against the conventional interpretation before Gould, and these are very serious issues. So Simpson made a strategic shift from talking about directed evolution to talking about the deterministic reasoning more directly. Biological justification for the totalitarian development of society has also been sought in the doctrines of evolutionary fatalism. Regardless of such labels as right, wrong, good, or bad, it is argued, this is the inevitable future. Mankind is going this way just as horsekind was going toward Equus throughout the tertiary. Opposition is as futile and foolish as if the little Eohippus had said, I'm going to be a dinosaur instead of a horse. Even aside from the fact that this is another false use of analogy, it has been shown that a fatalistic view of evolution has little scientific support. So this is what I refer to as the iconography of the radical interpretation. There's a like a poster-sized version of this that is hanging on the wall at the anthropology department at Penn State, and I used to really enjoy looking at it. You'll see it a lot of places, especially in like evolution education, and you see this sort of birth of the earth here, and then we're going out in time in both directions, so that if you were to sort of start out here and look for humans, which are in here somewhere. Oh, here we go. All right, so we're over here on this little branch, and you'd see how late comers to the game we truly are. And also you see the tremendous persistence of the bacteria, the archaea, the other eukaryotes, and going this way, this is all eukaryotes. But you see the earlier families. And my thing that I think Gould would like the most is that you see the decimation and diversification. You see that most of the lines that start anywhere don't make it, and that's because out here on the edge where we have sort of the contemporary biota on the rim, most things don't make it there. Most things have gone extinct, and so you really see the mass decimation. You see that most things just haven't made it. Of course, this is the hominin ancestry here, and you see much more of that branching pattern. We don't see sort of a linear progress inferring direct ancestry. You can see the overlap in time where various hominin species would have been on the Earth at the same time, and so this is a much more what we consider to be an accurate representation currently, and this is sort of our primate lineage here. So you see the breaking off of different primate groups. There's different monkey groups up here, and then down here you see the great apes, and so then you can start up here where we're trying to place here next to our cousins, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, and then you can sort of start tracing common ancestry back with different groups, and again you see some of the branches that did not make it. So that's what I call the iconography of the radical interpretation. And that brings us to replaying life's tape during the experimental era. So I'm going to talk to you about the experiment that goes on in my lab. It wasn't really directly, I'd say, inspired by Stephen Jay Gould's replaying the tape of life, because I think it started actually a year or so beforehand. but Stephen Jay Gould did write about it, and they're often brought up together because it is sort of a realization of that and the idea. So I'll let that clip play, and then I'll kind of wrap up. All right, so.
Richard doesn't have billions of years to watch evolution in action, but he does have the span of one lifetime, which he has dedicated to performing the longest evolutionary experiment in the history of science. 27 years ago, Richard plucked 12 genetically identical E. coli bacteria from a container and allowed them to start their own populations in 12 separate worlds. Ever since, day after day, he's watched each of the 12 populations multiply and compete amongst themselves for a limited amount of food.
Key part of the experiment is just keeping it going day after day after day, transferring a small amount from each flask into fresh medium each day, and the bacteria grow and replicate in that fresh medium until they run out of the sugar that they grow on, and then they sit there until the next day. That whole process is repeated.
At the end of every day, he allowed a small sample of the survivors to continue producing new generations. Year after year, the daily process went on and on. In each flask, the cells of bacteria replicate, passing on tiny random mutations to their offspring's DNA. For the first 15 years of the experiment, the separated populations evolved pretty much in lockstep, each strain gradually adapting to this flask environment. But one night, one of the colonies had a sudden and dramatic victory in the arms race of evolution.
One day we came in and found that one of our flasks had many more bacteria than the others. One of the lines of bacteria, after they'd finished the glucose, they said, there's something else to eat. And that gave them a huge advantage.
Overnight, these E. coli had switched on new and complex internal machinery that allowed them to extract energy from a benign chemical additive. Armed with this new talent, they vanquished their competitors. But when Richard examined the DNA of these E. coli, he realized that the mutation that switched on the new talent was merely the last in a long series. The others had lain dormant for thousands of generations. Richard thinks of it as life playing a grand version of his favorite game, poker.
I always liked playing games that involved a mixture of luck and skill. Most card games, you've got the shuffling, and yet poker takes some skill to make a lot of money.
For E. coli and humans alike, each genetic mutation is like a new card dealt to the species. If the right hand is made in the right order, the organism can win big for posterity.
In this case, the bacteria had this key mutation, but it had to happen in the context where there were other mutations before it.
When there is a queen and a king of hearts on the table and you have the 10 and ace of hearts in your hand, you are set up to potentially make a royal flush, the most powerful hand in poker. All you need is for the final card to be a jack of hearts.
Well, if you were looking for a third 7, that does you no good at all. But if you got the other parts of a royal flush, you're happy.
E. coli adapt to meet their immediate needs through genetic mutation. But some mutations don't have an immediate reward. They are investments for their distant descendants, so that they can win a big evolutionary jackpot.
All right, so that is like its own version of a replay experiment, right? Because instead of just having one history of this single organism evolving for 30 years, we have 12 histories going at the same time. And this picture here is of Dr. Zachary Blount. He was actually in that video working in the background. And this is, they call them towers. I refer to it as Solomon's Temple. But it actually shows you just some of the massive amounts of lab work that goes into it. Zach did a lot of the experiments of figuring out that potential lay dormant for thousands of generations, and then also figuring out what those mutations were, and a lot of other work that's been done on that project and others in the lab, including actually a lot of great work on the history of this whole replaying the tape of life metaphor and how it's been converted into the current experimental program that our lab is happy to be a part of. So this shows us some of the different versions of the replay experiment. Of course, none of them are on the grand scale of replaying the tape of life of Earth's natural history the way Gould envisioned. But nevertheless, these are different ways that we do it in the lab, and they are all used in their own way to answer very important questions about contingency and evolution. So this first design, A, is pretty much the way the LTE is set up. You start with one organism, it gets separated into its own separate flask, so that's why they're all isolated in their own world, and then it evolves and you can freeze samples, and then you can revive those samples. Bacteria you can just throw them in the freezer in a little bit of their environment, and you can revive them, and so you can compete them against their direct descendants, and you can also compete them against their direct ancestors, which is pretty cool. And a lot of what Zach did to figure out the evolutionary history involved doing these analytic replays where you're taking one of the lineages, in that case the one that evolved that unique trait, and you're restarting evolutionary experiments to see that in fact the probability of evolving that trait did increase through evolutionary time. So that's how you know, oh, it didn't just pop up overnight. It actually had been sort of brewing and figuring out that, that trait did itself evolve gradually, and then going back and figuring out the mutations were. So lots of cool stuff. And then now these historical difference experiments, remember Gould talked about this idea that you're always evolving to your local adaptation, to your local environment, but that local environment is changing. And so now we're interested in how does the history that you evolve in one environment affect your ability to evolve in a new environment. And so what you see here with C is you can do something like the LTE. These are all two-phase experiments. So you replay the tape of life from one common starting point, and then you take a single representative organism from each of those different lines, and you start the process again. But now, since you're starting from different lineages, they all now have their own independent history. So starting from here, there's one history, but if you start from here in the second phase, now you have all these different histories. And so you can see how their evolution in the second environment is influenced by the history they evolved in the first environment. With D, you do something similar, except you start with two different environments, and then you see how the difference in the adaptation to those two different environments affects later evolution to the same environment. So the only difference between them in the second phase is whether they came from the blue or the yellow environment during the first phase. And you can kind of do that by just going out and sampling from a bunch of different wild populations in nature, and then allowing them to evolve in a common laboratory environment. And I will post a link in the description of this video to another video I made about the experiment that I've been working on for my dissertation, which is actually like a digital version of the long-term evolution experiment that we've done with a computer program called the Vita. And in case you're wondering like where that experiment fits in on this type of thing, it's kind of like D, but flipped around, or I think of it as being like C with two different environments. So you start with a common environment like you would in C, and then when you go to phase 2, you actually, instead of going to one environment, you take each copy and you put it in a second environment. And what that does is one of those environments is similar to the phase 1 environment, and one of those environments is very different from the phase 1 environment. So now we're trying to ask the question of, well, if you think about going from one environment to another environment, the first question that might pipe into your head is like, what's the new environment, right? Is the new environment like similar to my old environment, or is the new environment something totally different? Okay, and so now we're trying to ask, how does the difference between your new environment and your old environment influence your ability to adapt in that new environment? So that's what's going on in that experiment, and that's like another wrinkle to these replay experiments. And so there are many different forms of that we do this in the lab, and there are actually different ways that this has kind of happened throughout natural history. So we call those natural replay experiments that we've been sort of granted by the history of life on Earth without any intentional design, and then the sort of the remixes that we make in the lab. And so I will leave you with this quote from Theodosius Dobzhansky from an essay by the same name. And it's that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. We must always remember that biology is the study of life and evolution is its central theory. I believe that the Darwinian revolution is still incomplete and still facing active resistance. While the fact of evolution has seemingly overwhelmed many, although not all, of its most ardent resistors, it's the full implications of the theory that we are still struggling to come to grips with. I hope that this video helps you in understanding this radical view of life. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.